There are apparently protesters going around holding flags saying, "Abolish the House of Sussex."
Every day for 10 years, I have been bullied and attacked, and I was the most trolled person in the entire world, man or woman. And I'm still here.
Disrespected this country, disrespected the Queen, and the entire royal family. We don't want you here, Meghan, and we don't want you here, Harry.
Australia was supposed to be just another stop, another appearance, another carefully managed visit, but within hours of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry arriving, something far more volatile began unfolding beneath the surface, something louder, sharper, and far more divided than anyone expected. And the real question is, was this ever just a visit, or was it always going to become a storm? Because almost immediately, the atmosphere didn't feel welcoming, it felt charged, as if every movement, every appearance, every word was being watched not with curiosity, but with suspicion.
Before she entered the area with the children, Meghan Markle had said just 4 words. Let's make this quick. What a humanitarian she is! Not.
Disrespected this country, disrespected the Queen, and the entire royal family. We don't want you here, Meghan, and we don't want you here, Harry.
When you understand the sort of the Machiavellian PR moves behind it, that's so cynical, and to exploit these children like that and force them to meet Harry and Meghan. I mean, haven't these kids suffered enough? This is pretty grim stuff for them to be.
And this is where things begin to shift from a simple tour into something much more complex. At first glance, the structure looked familiar: public appearances, community visits, carefully timed engagements. But if you step back for a moment, you start to notice a pattern forming, one that doesn't quite align with a traditional royal tour, and that raises an uncomfortable question. Are we watching service, or are we watching strategy? And this is where the tension really begins to build, because the moment Meghan spoke publicly about her experience with online abuse, framing it as a decade-long daily reality, the narrative didn't just spread, it detonated across media, across platforms, across audiences already divided in how they see her. On one side, there were those who saw it as long overdue honesty, a rare moment where someone in her position directly acknowledged the scale of scrutiny that comes with global visibility. But on the other side, there were those who immediately questioned the framing, not the existence of criticism, but the scale of the claim itself, and suddenly, one sentence became something much bigger than a statement. It became a battleground. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because in today's media environment, perception doesn't just follow reality, it often replaces it, meaning that once a narrative takes hold, it doesn't need to be proven, it only needs to be repeated, and repeated enough times, it becomes identity. So now ask yourself this: when you hear a statement like that, do you see vulnerability, or do you see positioning? Because while that debate was still unfolding, something else happened almost simultaneously, and this is the part most people miss if they're not paying close attention, because while Meghan's comments were dominating headlines, Prince Harry stepped into a completely different conversation, one centered around digital safety and social media restrictions. At first, it sounded straightforward, even responsible, but in the broader context of their global presence, it created a strange contradiction, because here is a couple deeply connected to digital platforms, to global visibility, to media influence, now aligning themselves with restrictions on those same systems, and suddenly, the narrative splits again. Is this leadership, or is it repositioning? And just when it seems like the story might stabilize into two clear sides, something else enters the frame, something smaller, almost insignificant at first, but quickly amplified into something symbolic. And that is where this entire situation begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Because nothing around this tour is being viewed in isolation anymore. Not the clothing, not the timing, not even the tone of each appearance. Everything is being pulled into a larger interpretation, one where every detail is treated as intentional. And this is where you start to see the real shift, because once audiences begin interpreting everything as strategy, even the most ordinary moments lose their neutrality, and that changes everything. So let me ask you this: do you think people are reacting to what they are actually seeing, or to what they believe is happening behind the scenes? Because as this perception builds, it doesn't stay contained to speeches or statements, it expands outward, into image, into identity, into branding, and that is where the next layer of the story starts to reveal itself. Observers began noticing something subtle but consistent, a shift in presentation, in tone, in visual identity, where appearances no longer felt purely ceremonial, but increasingly aligned with something more modern, more commercial, more controlled, and once that idea takes hold, it reframes everything that follows. Now suddenly, what might have once been dismissed as personal style or public presence starts to look like something else entirely, a coordinated evolution, where visibility is not just exposure, but currency. And this is exactly where the divide deepens, because for some, this represents independence, a move away from traditional royal constraints into a new form of influence. But for others, it raises a far more uncomfortable question. Is this still about public service, or has it become something else entirely? And just when that question begins to settle into the background, the situation escalates again, because the reaction inside Australia itself doesn't remain neutral, it begins to fragment, and that fragmentation is what turns this from a media story into something far more unpredictable. Because now, it's no longer just global audiences debating meaning, it's local sentiments starting to respond in real time, and when that happens, the tone shifts from analysis to reaction. And this is where everything becomes harder to control, because once public perception on the ground starts diverging from the intended narrative, every appearance becomes riskier, every moment becomes more scrutinized, and every action carries weight far beyond what it appears to be. So here's the critical question. Was this backlash inevitable, or was it triggered by something specific that pushed it over the edge? Because as we move forward, what you're about to see is how this tension doesn't just stay online, it begins to materialize in ways that are impossible to ignore, and once that happens, the entire dynamic of this tour changes completely. And that is exactly where the situation takes a turn that no one can downplay anymore. Because what began as quiet tension did not stay quiet for long, and this is exactly where the situation starts to shift from controlled narrative into visible disruption, because across parts of Australia, something unexpected began surfacing, not just criticism, not just commentary, but actual public resistance forming in real time, and the question is, what pushed it to that point? At first, the signs were subtle, small pockets of dissatisfaction, muted reactions, a sense that the public mood wasn't aligning with the polished imagery being presented. But then something changed, and once it changed, it became impossible to ignore. Because when protests begin to emerge, even if they start small, they signal something deeper than disagreement. They signal a break in perception, a moment where the audience is no longer passively consuming the narrative, but actively pushing back against it, and that is where things become unpredictable. And here's where it gets critical, because protests are not just about presence, they are about symbolism. They represent a visible rejection of what is being presented, and when that happens during a high-profile visit involving Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, it immediately transforms the entire context of the tour. So ask yourself this, are people reacting to specific actions, or are they reacting to a larger narrative that has been building over time? Because this didn't come out of nowhere, and this is the part that most surface-level coverage completely misses, because what we are seeing here is not just a reaction to one event, but a culmination of multiple layers that have been stacking quietly in the background. There is the history of previous visits, there is the ongoing global media narrative, there is the shift from royal duty to independent identity, and when all of these elements converge in one place, at one time, under intense public scrutiny, the result is almost always friction. And that friction is exactly what begins to manifest on the ground, because once people start questioning intent, every appearance becomes a trigger point, every movement becomes open to interpretation, and suddenly, even routine engagements begin to carry a different weight. And this is where the situation becomes even more complex, because alongside these visible reactions, there is another layer unfolding at the same time, one that operates more quietly but is just as influential, and that is the conversation around optics. Because critics are no longer just questioning what is happening, they are questioning how it is happening, the environments chosen, the timing of visits, the emotional framing of appearances, and once that line of thinking takes hold, it changes how everything is perceived. Now suddenly, visits to hospitals, interactions with vulnerable communities, and moments designed to convey empathy are being viewed through a completely different lens, not just as acts of engagement, but as potential narrative shields. And this is where the discomfort starts to deepen, because once people begin to suspect that emotional settings are being used strategically, even genuine moments become difficult to separate from perception, and that creates a tension that is incredibly hard to resolve. So let me ask you this, when you see these moments, do you interpret them as sincere, or do you feel like there is something more calculated beneath the surface? Because that question sits at the center of everything that is unfolding, and it is exactly why reactions have become so polarized, because once intent becomes unclear, people fill in the gaps based on what they already believe. And this is where the narrative begins to split even further, because supporters continue to frame these appearances as meaningful, as impactful, as necessary visibility for important causes, while critics interpret the same moments as carefully constructed imagery designed to influence perception. Two completely different conclusions drawn from the exact same events, and that is what makes this situation so volatile. Because when reality itself becomes subjective, when the same image can generate opposite interpretations depending on who is watching, the narrative stops being stable, and instead become something that shifts constantly based on perspective. And that instability is exactly what fuels the escalation we are seeing now, because once a narrative loses its fixed meaning, it becomes vulnerable to amplification, to distortion, to rapid transformation, and that is when things can spiral. And here is where another important layer enters the story, one that adds even more tension to the situation, and that is the question of money, because behind the public-facing appearances, there is an ongoing conversation about commercial activity, about branding, about monetization. Because while the external narrative emphasizes connection, empathy, and advocacy, there is also a parallel structure involving speaking engagements, partnerships, and visibility that operates alongside it, and that contrast is what critics keep returning to. On one side, there is emotional engagement, on the other, there is perceived commercial intent, and when those two exist at the same time, it creates a kind of imbalance that people find difficult to ignore. So now the question becomes even sharper. Can both things exist at once without undermining each other? Because this is not just about whether these activities are justified or not, it is about how they are perceived when placed side by side, and perception, as we have already seen, is what drives everything in this environment. And just when it seems like the situation has reached a peak, another development begins to pull attention in a completely different direction, something that introduces an entirely new kind of debate, one that moves away from public service and into cultural relevance. Because Meghan's appearance in a mainstream entertainment setting during the trip doesn't just add visibility, it changes the context entirely. Because now the conversation is no longer just about humanitarian engagement, it is about positioning within modern media. And this is where the lines begin to blur even further, because when traditional roles intersect with entertainment platforms, it creates a hybrid identity that is difficult for audiences to categorize. Is this evolution, or is it distraction? And more importantly, how does that shift impact the credibility of everything else happening around it? Because once audiences begin to question consistency, once they start noticing contrasts between different types of appearances, the narrative becomes harder to maintain, and that is when scrutiny intensifies. So let me ask you this. Does this feel like a natural progression, or does it feel like something that doesn't quite align? Because as this confusion builds, it feeds directly back into the larger reaction we are seeing on the ground, because uncertainty fuels doubt, and doubt fuels resistance. And that resistance is exactly what we are now seeing take more visible form, because when people are no longer convinced by the narrative being presented, they don't just question it, they challenge it. And this is where the situation moves into its most unstable phase yet, because once public reaction shifts from passive disagreement to active expression, the entire dynamic changes. Because now, this is no longer just about how the story is being told, it is about how it is being received, and more importantly, how it is being rejected. And that is the turning point. Because from here, what happens next is no longer fully controlled by messaging, by strategy, or by presentation. It is influenced by something far more unpredictable, public sentiment in real time. And as that sentiment continues to evolve, what you're about to see next is where the pressure reaches a level that forces even deeper questions about authenticity, intent, and the true nature of this entire tour. Because once public resistance becomes visible, it doesn't just stay at the level of protest, it begins to reshape how every single moment is interpreted, and this is exactly where the pressure surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry intensifies in a way that is far more difficult to manage. Because now the conversation is no longer about isolated events, it is about consistency, and whether the story being presented actually aligns with what people believe they are seeing. And this is where things start to get uncomfortable, because once audiences begin searching for patterns, they rarely stop at the surface, they begin connecting moments, comparing appearances, analyzing tone, timing, and intent, and when that process begins, even small details can take on disproportionate significance. Because think about it for a moment. When one visit emphasizes emotional connection, another highlights media visibility, and another introduces elements of entertainment or branding, it creates a layered perception that is not easily reconciled, and that is where doubt starts to grow. So let me ask you this. When you look at all these appearances together, do they feel aligned to you, or do they feel like separate narratives trying to exist at the same time? Because that tension between alignment and contradiction is exactly what begins to dominate the conversation at this stage. And once that tension becomes the focus, it pulls attention away from individual actions and toward the bigger picture. And here is where the narrative takes another sharp turn, because the discussion is no longer just about what is being done, it is about why it is being done, and that shift from action to intention is what escalates everything. Because questioning actions can be debated, but questioning intent introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is what drives the strongest reactions. And this is where the concept of optics becomes central, not as a background idea, but as the main lens through which everything is viewed, because once audiences begin to interpret events through optics, they stop asking, "What happened?" and start asking, "What does this represent?" And that is a completely different level of scrutiny. Because now, a hospital visit is not just a hospital visit, it becomes a symbol. A community engagement is not just outreach, it becomes a message, and every appearance carries meaning beyond its immediate context. And when that happens, the margin for neutrality disappears. So now ask yourself this: do you think any public figure can operate in this environment without being misinterpreted, or does visibility itself guarantee distortion? Because that question sits at the core of what is unfolding here, and it explains why reactions have become so intense, because once symbolism replaces simplicity, everything becomes open to interpretation. And this is where another layer begins to surface, one that adds even more complexity to the situation, and that is the issue of credibility. Because when different elements of a public presence begin to feel disconnected, audiences start evaluating not just the actions, but the authenticity behind them, and that evaluation is rarely neutral. Supporters continue to see consistency, they see advocacy, they see adaptation to a modern media landscape, but critics begin to see something else entirely, a shift toward controlled image construction, where every appearance is part of a broader strategy. Two interpretations, both built on the same events, but leading to completely different conclusions. And this is exactly why the situation continues to escalate, because there is no single narrative that everyone agrees on. Instead, there are competing narratives, each reinforcing itself through selective interpretation. And once that happens, the conversation stops being about truth and starts being about alignment, people choosing the version of events that fits their existing perspective. So let me ask you this: when you hear these competing narratives, do you find yourself leaning toward one side, or do you feel like something still doesn't fully add up? Because that feeling, that uncertainty, is what keeps the story alive. It prevents resolution, it keeps the debate moving, and it ensures that every new development is immediately pulled into the same cycle of interpretation. And speaking of new developments, this is where the situation becomes even more layered, because alongside the ongoing scrutiny, there is a growing focus on how influence is being exercised. Not formal authority, not official power, but something more subtle, something less defined, what could be described as soft influence. Because even without official roles, there is still recognition, there is still visibility, there is still an association with institutional structures that carries weight, and that creates a unique dynamic. Because now, their presence operates in a space that is neither fully official nor fully independent, and that ambiguity is what generates so much debate. Is this a continuation of influence, or a reinvention of it? And more importantly, how does that ambiguity affect how their actions are perceived? Because once audiences are unsure about the framework within which someone is operating, they begin to question everything within that framework. And that brings us to another critical point, the role of media amplification, because in an environment like this, nothing remains contained, every moment is captured, clipped, shared, and reinterpreted within minutes. And that speed of amplification changes everything. Because it means that perception is not formed slowly, it is formed instantly, often before full context is even available, and once that initial perception takes hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to shift. So now the question becomes, are we reacting to reality, or are we reacting to the fastest version of reality that reaches us? Because that distinction matters, and it is exactly what fuels the ongoing cycle of reaction, amplification, and further reaction. And this is where the situation begins to feel almost self-sustaining, because every new moment feeds into an existing narrative, and that narrative in turn shapes how the next moment is received. It becomes a loop. And once a narrative loop forms, it is very hard to break. So let me ask you this: do you think this situation is escalating because of what is happening, or because of how it is being interpreted? Because that difference is subtle, but it changes everything. And as this loop continues to build, the pressure doesn't just remain external, it starts to affect the internal structure of the narrative itself, forcing it to adapt, to respond, to shift in real time. And that is where the next phase begins, because when a narrative is forced to adapt under pressure, it often reveals something deeper, something that was not immediately visible at the surface. And what you're about to see next is exactly that, a deeper layer of the story that moves beyond reaction and into something far more revealing, something that begins to answer not just what is happening, but why it feels so unsettled in the first place. Because once a narrative is forced to adapt under pressure, it rarely becomes clearer, it usually becomes more revealing. And this is exactly where the situation surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry begins to expose something deeper than public reaction, something that sits beneath appearances, beneath messaging, beneath even the events themselves. And this is where we move beyond what is happening into how it is being constructed. Because at this stage, the question is no longer whether the tour is controversial. That part is already obvious. The real question is whether the structure of the tour itself is contributing to that controversy in ways that were either underestimated or entirely intentional. And this is where things become far more complex, because when you begin to examine the sequence of events, the types of locations chosen, the emotional tone of each appearance, and the timing of media exposure, a pattern starts to emerge that doesn't feel random. It feels designed. Now, that does not automatically mean it is manipulative, but it does mean it is deliberate, and once audiences begin to sense deliberateness, they start asking a different kind of question. Not, what are they doing, but, what is this meant to achieve? And that shift in questioning changes everything. Because when intent becomes the focus, every detail becomes evidence. So let me ask you this. When you see repeated visits to emotionally sensitive environments, do you see compassion leading the moment, or do you see messaging shaping the moment? Because that distinction is exactly where the divide is widening. And this is where one of the most uncomfortable themes begins to surface more clearly, the idea that certain environments, particularly those involving vulnerability, are not just being visited, but are becoming central to how the narrative is being framed. Because think about the impact of those settings: hospitals, communities in crisis, individuals facing hardship. These are environments that naturally generate empathy, they create emotional gravity, and that gravity has a powerful effect on how any associated image is received. Now here is where it becomes complicated. Because if those environments are genuinely part of meaningful engagement, then their presence is justified. But if audiences begin to believe that those same environments are also functioning as narrative anchors, as moments that reshape public perception, then the interpretation changes completely. And once that doubt enters the equation, it becomes incredibly difficult to remove. So now ask yourself this: can emotional impact and strategic presentation exist at the same time without conflicting with each other? Because that is the tension at the heart of this phase of the story. And this is where the narrative begins to split again, not into two sides this time, but into multiple layers, because now we are not just dealing with supporters and critics, we are dealing with varying degrees of interpretation. Some see sincerity with strategic awareness, others see strategy overshadowing sincerity, and some are no longer sure what to believe at all. And that uncertainty is what fuels the ongoing escalation. Because uncertainty invites speculation, and speculation invites amplification. And once amplification begins, it rarely stays contained. And here is where another critical layer becomes impossible to ignore: the relationship between visibility and value. Because in the modern media landscape, visibility is not just attention, it is currency, it has measurable impact, it drives engagement, it creates opportunities, and when visibility is consistently aligned with emotionally powerful environments, it raises questions about how that value is being generated. Now again, this does not automatically imply intent, but it does create a perception that is difficult to separate from the events themselves. And perception, as we have already seen, is what drives everything. So let me ask you this: do you think audiences are reacting to actions, or are they reacting to the perceived value behind those actions? Because that difference is subtle, but it changes how everything is interpreted. And as this perception continues to evolve, it begins to interact with another powerful force: expectation. Because public figures operating at this level are not just observed, they are expected to meet certain standards, and when those expectations are unclear or constantly shifting, it creates a gap. And that gap is where criticism grows. Because some audiences expect traditional restraint, others expect modern transparency, and when both expectations exist simultaneously, it becomes almost impossible to satisfy both. And that is exactly the position this narrative finds itself in, caught between two frameworks that do not fully align. And when that happens, every action risks being interpreted as insufficient by one side or excessive by the other. So now the question becomes even more complex. Are these reactions a result of what is being done, or are they a result of conflicting expectations that can never fully be met? Because if it is the latter, then the situation is not just controversial, it is structurally unstable. And this is where the pressure intensifies even further, because as expectations collide with perception, the narrative begins to fracture. And once a narrative fractures, it becomes harder to control, harder to guide, and far more susceptible to sudden shifts. And that is exactly what we begin to see next. Because as the tour continues, the accumulation of reactions, interpretations, and expectation starts to create a tipping point, a moment where the conversation is no longer evolving gradually, but accelerating. And when acceleration happens, everything becomes more extreme. Support becomes stronger, criticism becomes sharper, and neutrality begins to disappear entirely. So let me ask you this. Do you feel like this situation is becoming clearer, or does it feel like it is becoming more confusing the more it unfolds? Because that feeling of confusion is not accidental. It is a natural result of multiple narratives colliding at the same time. And this is where the story begins to enter its most critical phase yet, because once clarity is lost, audiences start looking for resolution. They want answers, they want conclusions, they want something that makes sense of everything they are seeing. But what happens when there is no single answer? What happens when the situation itself resists simplification? Because that is exactly where we are now. And what comes next is where all of these layers, perception, expectation, visibility, and interpretation, begin to converge into something much more decisive, something that pushes the narrative toward a point where it can no longer remain in the state of uncertainty. And that turning point is closer than it seems. Because when a situation reaches the point where clarity begins to disappear instead of increase, it usually means one thing, that everything is moving toward a decisive moment. And this is exactly where the narrative surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry finally starts to reveal its most critical truth. Not through a single event, not through one headline, but through the accumulation of everything that has happened so far. Because at this stage, what we are witnessing is no longer just a reaction to appearances, it is a reaction to a pattern that has now become visible enough that people are no longer debating isolated moments, they are questioning the entire structure behind them. And this is where the narrative takes its final shift. Because once audiences begin evaluating the structure instead of the surface, the conversation becomes far more difficult to control, and far more difficult to redirect. So let me ask you this. When you look at everything together now, does it feel like a series of disconnected events, or does it feel like something that has been building toward this exact reaction? Because that distinction determines how this story ends. And this is where the role of perception reaches its peak influence, because by now, opinions are no longer forming, they are solidifying. Supporters have settled into their interpretation, seeing resilience, adaptation, and a modern approach to influence, while critics have settled into theirs, seeing inconsistency, overexposure, and strategic positioning. And between those two positions, there is very little space left. And that lack of space is what creates intensity. Because when there is no middle ground, every new development doesn't just add information, it reinforces existing beliefs. And that is exactly what makes this phase so decisive. Because now, every appearance, every statement, every image is no longer being judged independently. It is being filtered through a conclusion that has already been formed. So now ask yourself this. Do you think anything they do at this point can actually change public perception, or has that perception already been locked in? Because if it has been locked in, then what we are watching is no longer influence, it is momentum. And momentum is far more powerful. Because momentum does not need new evidence. It feeds on repetition, it grows through amplification, and once it reaches a certain level, it becomes self-sustaining. And that is exactly what this situation feels like now. A narrative that is no longer being driven by events alone, but by the reaction to those events. And this is where things become particularly interesting, because once momentum takes over, control becomes limited. Not impossible, but significantly reduced. Because even carefully planned appearances, carefully worded statements, and carefully managed visuals cannot fully counteract a narrative that has already gained speed. And that raises a deeper question. Is this situation the result of miscalculation, or is it the unavoidable outcome of operating in a media environment where every action is amplified beyond its original intent? Because that distinction matters. Because if it is miscalculation, then it suggests that something could have been done differently. But if it is unavoidable, then it suggests that this outcome was always going to happen, regardless of the choices made along the way. So let me ask you this. Do you believe this backlash was preventable, or do you think it was inevitable from the moment this tour began? Because your answer to that question shapes how you interpret everything that came before it. And this is where the final layer of this story comes into focus, not the events themselves, but what they represent in a broader sense. Because this is not just about one tour, or one country, or even two individuals. It is about the changing nature of public life, where visibility is constant, where narratives form instantly, where perception moves faster than context, and where the line between authenticity and presentation becomes increasingly difficult to define. And in that environment, every public figure faces the same challenge. How do you remain genuine in a system that constantly transforms genuine moments into content? And that is the question that sits at the center of everything we have just seen. Because regardless of where you stand, whether you see sincerity or strategy, evolution or contradiction, one thing is clear. This situation has moved beyond simple interpretation. It has become a reflection of how modern narratives are built, challenged, and amplified in real time. And that is why it feels so unresolved. Because it is not just about what happened. It is about what it means. So now, I want to turn this back to you. After everything we have just broken down, every layer, every reaction, every shift in perception, what do you actually think is going on here? Do you see a couple navigating a hostile media landscape while trying to redefine their role, or do you see a carefully structured narrative that is starting to lose control under public scrutiny? Because this is exactly where your perspective matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those stories where no two people are seeing it the same way, and that is what makes it so powerful. And if you've made it this far, you already understand that this is not just surface-level drama. This is a developing narrative that is still unfolding in real time, and the next shift could completely change how everything we discussed is perceived. So make sure you stay connected, subscribe if you haven't already, and keep following this closely, because this story is not slowing down, it is evolving. And the next update might just reveal what all of this was really leading to all along.